Hello everyone, it's Michelle Lupton here for Picket Studios, and I am going to be sharing with you how I made this card using products from the October release from Picket Studios. So this is one that I've already made and I'm going to be recreating this in this video. It won't be identical, but it'll be very similar. So I'm using these dies that are brand new from Picket Fence. We have the maple leaf die, the oak leaves die and the ash leaves die, and I'm also going to be using the Thank You for Being You stamp set and this stencil, which is the fancy Kaleidoscope stencil. So I'm going to be starting with some white cardstock and I'm going to be die cutting out a whole bunch of these leaves. So I've cut out multiples so I would have plenty to work with. And I'm just going to start by placing them on this cardstock. Now, before I get too far into this, I just want to point out that this technique that I'm using, I got from Dawn Walslagel from W+9. She did a live video on Facebook just recently where she made an absolutely stunning card using this technique. I've slightly modified it from what she did, and I asked her permission if I could use it in this video, and she said yes. So here we are. So on her card, she made a wintry card. So she used sort of Christmassy images, dies, and blues and greens and a little bit of purple on her card. Of course, I'm going to be using autumnal colours for these autumn leaves. So I've just stuck them down using my tape runner adhesive, and you can see that I cut some off the edges and then placed them onto little bits on the edge that I thought were missing a little bit. You can see I'm doing one of those there. So you don't want to waste anything that's hanging off the edge, but I think it looks better if at least some of the leaves are actually hanging off the edge of this panel. All right, so I'm using my Teflon bone folder here to make sure that all of these are stuck down quite nicely, because I'm going to be doing ink blending over the top and I don't want them to budge. So I've got out some Distress Oxide inks. I'm actually only going to be using 4 of these, not 5. I decided to get rid of the fossilized amber. So I'm using Scattered Straw, Spiced Marmalade, Ripe Persimmon and Aged Mahogany. So I'm using my life-changing blender brushes, and you might have seen that I actually have little bits of washi tape just on the neck of these brushes so that I know which colour family to use with each one. I don't really want to spend time every single time that I use these brushes to clean them under, like with soap and water. I do clean them by just rubbing them off onto some scrap paper or onto a baby wipe. But I don't often wash them under soap and water. I tend to just use them with Distress Oxide inks. If I am going to use them with a different type of ink, I will give them a bit of a clean before that. But yeah, I tend to use them mainly with Distress Oxides. Now, these particular life-changing blender brushes are well, they're not the smallest ones. The smallest ones are teeny tiny, but these ones certainly aren't the biggest ones. I keep my biggest ones for the colours that I use the most, which are blues and greens. I am very much a blues and greens kind of girl. These colours that I'm using today are completely outside of my comfort zone. I really, very, very rarely use oranges and yellows and browns. I do use orange and yellow when I do rainbows, which is quite often, but not by themselves. I decided not to use the fossilized amber, and I'm just going to show you now how I actually label these Distress Oxide pads, and I do this for my Distress ink pads as well. I tend to just have them stacked up on the shelf, so having a little colour label on the side helps me find which one is which. All right, so now I've got this stencil and it still has a little bit of stickiness from the last time I applied some pixie spray. I probably should have sprayed it again, and you'll see why in just a minute. But I'm just adding a very light application of this Aged Mahogany over the stencil just to give a little bit more interest to this background. So I tried to keep this bit over the paler regions, and you can see right now that's where I should have used the extra pixie spray. So I'm just going to hold it down a little bit more carefully to finish off this little bit of stenciling. All right, so I was happy with that, but I'm still not finished because I'm going to add some Perfect Pearls mists. So this is just Perfect Pearls mixed in water. I originally bought the Perfect Pearls mist, but I used that up a long time ago. So I've just refilled this spray bottle with Perfect Pearls in the colour Perfect Pearl and just add tap water. And I'm just spraying that onto the card, but then I also put some onto my work surface and splattered it over the top so I could get some big splodges of that Perfect Pearls. I'm now going to do the same thing with the aged mahogany to get some dark splatters. And you can see I'm not taking great care with this. Sadly, the first time I made this card, I actually had some cards in envelopes that were ready to go into the mail just sitting on the side of my desk, and they got splatters of aged mahogany all over them. So the people who receive them in the next couple of weeks, that's why you've got splatters of ink on your envelope. And now I'm going to be doing the same. I got out some Hero Arts Unicorn White pigment ink, and I'm going to be doing the same with that just to give some more intense white splatters. Now what Dawn did on her card is she splattered with water and added some white embossing powder. So she had little splatters of white embossing powder, which was much more intense, but I decided not to go with that today. All right, so now on to the sentiment. And as I said, I'm using the Thank You for Being You sentiment, which is new from the October release at Picket Fence Studios. I really think that this thank you stamp is going to be a firm favourite of mine. I can see it going on almost every thank you card I ever make from now on. It's just lovely. I love the flourishes on the Y of the U and the K of the thank. They're just gorgeous. All right, so I'm using some Versamark ink here, going to ink up my stamp. I lined it up in my Misty to make sure that the two sentiment stamps were fairly straight. Inked it with my Versamark, and now I'm adding some white embossing powder. This is from Hero Arts, which is my favourite white embossing powder. And I did actually prep it with the powder tool, as you saw, but I still got a couple of little bits of embossing powder where I didn't want. I must have had some big fingerprints, heavy fingerprints on that cardstock because they stuck where I didn't want. So now I'm embossing it. And even after embossing and removing that powder tool residue, I actually saw that there was still a couple of little spots of embossing powder where I didn't want. So I'm just going in with my craft knife here and just scratching off those tiny little bits. Now, to cut out this sentiment, instead of cutting just completely around it with fussy cutting, I decided that some bits I wanted to be straight. So the top of the U, the top of the A and the N, and the bottom of the sentiment, I wanted them to be straight. So that's where a paper trimmer like this one comes in handy. So you can actually cut in the middle of a piece of cardstock exactly where you want. But with the rest of the sentiment, I'm just going to run around it and fussy cut. And I'm using these scissors that I have had for ages. They're actually from Stamping Up, but I think they're actually Cutter-Bee scissors. And they are exceptionally sharp, and they're very, very useful. However, the ends of them is so sharp, I have stabbed myself so many times with these scissors. And last week when I was cutting something, I actually gave myself a little V-shaped cut right in the webbing of my fingers. I really need to be more careful around these scissors. But it is amazing how sharp they have remained because I've had them for 20 years and they haven't been sharpened once. Now what I'm doing now, there's just a couple of spots on some of these letters where the white embossing wasn't as solid as I liked because the cardstock is not perfectly flat. So I just added some white gel pen to fill in those dots. Now, word of warning for this bit, you will see that when I cut this panel down, some of the little bits of the die cuts are coming up off the edges, and you'll see I'm going to do this again here. See? Ah! And I was horrified by that. So, word of warning, if you want to do this technique and you want to cut your panel down, if you have a guillotine paper trimmer, use that instead of a paper trimmer like this one. Now, I don't have a guillotine paper trimmer. I used to, but I don't anymore. The only ones I have are this one, and one that has like a roller blade on it, which probably would have been better than this one, honestly. But yeah, hindsight is 20/20, isn't it? Yeah. So I just got a little bit of liquid glue and popped that tiny little bit that fell out back into place, and you would never, ever know. You can't even tell where it was. Okay, so I'm going to adhere this to my white card base. This is Nina Solar White paper, cardstock. And it's 120 pound weight, and I've cut it just so that it has a little bit of a white border around the edge. I just think that it's a nice little finish to it. I decided not to add a dark matte around it because I thought it was detailed enough. And now I'm just going to be adding my sentiment, and I'm just using some foam adhesive to the back. I'll spare you all the time that it took me to fit all those on and take all the backing pieces of paper off, the release paper off. And I'm almost done now, but I needed to do one last thing and add some sequins to the mix. So these are Picket Fence sequins. And, oh, what's the name of them? I think they're Irish coffee. Don't quote me on that. It'll be listed on my blog post, and I'll list it in the description below as well. I think it's Irish coffee. Anyway, I'm adding them with some liquid glue, and I'll spare you the amount of time it took me to actually arrange them on the cards because that always takes me ages. And that is the card. I'll just give you a little bit of a close-up so you can see all of the texture and all the different colours in there overlapping. And I hope you enjoyed this card. There's the original right next to it. You can see they're very similar but not the same. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you again next time. Bye.